Which cellular company has the best service? We're going to dive into that popular question on this episode of 5G Guys. Hey, everybody, this is Dan McVah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wayne Smith. Thanks for listening to another episode of the 5G Guys. Continuing on the theme of most frequently asked questions, we thought we'd tackle what's probably the most regular question any of us get in the industry is, who should I get for my cellular service from?
Yeah, I agree. I get that all the time, Wayne. And so I guess to dive into it, I'll just put you on the spot. What's your go-to answer when you get that question?
It's a good one, and I'm biased. So right now, I'm just going to speak a little bit of my bias. At our services company, Vertex Innovations, which is our sponsor, we have built networks for the last 18 years, and we've done a lot of projects for Verizon. And I think, my answer would be Verizon, and it comes from a lot of different places on how I get to that answer. As a business professional who travels a lot across the country, it's easy for me to see where my phone works and where it doesn't. And so I am a power user of my device to run my businesses. And without coverage, I pretty much know it immediately. And so my answer is, I think I have a set of criteria on what you're going to use it for. But I think for most people is like, does it work around your house? Right? Does it work in your neighborhood? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that people ask me, hey, man, I don't have a lot of coverage in my neighborhood. What can I do about it? And that's a tough question. But I think before I go down the rabbit hole in how I rate them all, I think that'd be a good starting point, Dan, is like what works around my neighborhood and where I live and where I spend the most of my time.
Yeah. And for me, I probably take a more agnostic answer. People get frustrated because I never give them the answer they're looking for. I just say, well, it depends. Uh-huh. I'm like, where do you use your service? You using it at home? Are you using it at work? Are you driving? Do you travel? Is your travel international or domestic? Those are the kinds of things I always ask them, because it just really depends where you're going to use it. And then secondly, what are you using it for? Are you just using it for phone, literally old school phone calls? Or are you doing basic data applications? Are you super heavy on, streaming live video and, watching a live sporting event or something like that? Because what I found is, depending on all those factors, as well as other factors like value, what are you willing to spend? Are you willing to pay a premium for some of those? Or are you on more of a budget or things of that nature? I think that's really ultimately what I answer people's questions with those questions. And then as they kind of tell me what they're looking for, I might give them a specific answer. But the biggest thing I try to explain to people is, they all have problems. Every carrier has problems in their network. And it's just a matter of where their problems reside. I always used to tell people my job as an engineer was to minimize how wrong I was and to put problems in the right places, as opposed to think I could get rid of the problems, because it is a wireless network and there's always areas that wireless will not work. And so optimizing that in your network to be where your customers are not is key. And you'll find that some carriers have customers in other areas that another carrier doesn't. And so their network's going to work better where their customers are oftentimes. So that's the generic answer I give. So it sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but that's typically my answer.
Well, it's a good answer. It's so true. The way that I kind of looked at it and how I rate it is I have a set of criteria, like if they're living in a city, I think all three have great coverage and reliability. This denser, network coverage there. So you're pretty much good. When you go to the next, where the suburbs of where a lot of people live, well, I still think reliability is pretty heavy there for the investment over the last 10 years in those areas. But when you start to get into rural areas, and what I mean by rural is tiny towns, farmland, the big part of what the Midwest and the Western U.S. is, it's a different story, and I think T-Mobile has a little ways to go in that area compared to Verizon and AT&T. Then I look at venues. I'd love to go to shows, whether it's I know you're a football fan, go to a lot of sporting events and concerts. And it seems that's where I want to share data, photos of it. And so I don't rate very many of the top three very good at any of the venues. Some of them are better than others, but venue type applications are tough on the mobile carriers because so many people. The other areas that I look to is purely off the grid type areas, like in the mountains where it's very hard to get coverage. I do weigh a little bit in that, where when I'm going out somewhere, I try to think about that process of what I need. If I need to be in touch with my family, or they know that I'm going to be gone because I'm going to have very limited. And then the last, I think a rarely important one for me and a lot of folks is driving. Mm-hmm. Who has the best coverage along your corridors in your life. Mm-hmm. And those are that's kind of my 6 categories. And so I think overall we've progressed so far that coverage goes a long way. I mean, we're in the 60 to 80, 70% range in all of those applications.
Hey, real quick, a quick word of thanks to today's sponsor, Vertex Innovations. For over 17 years, Vertex has been building the nation's wireless and broadband networks. Providing project management, network engineering, and construction oversight are just some of the ways Vertex helps their clients. So if you're looking for more of a partner to help you with your wireless network designs, construction, implementation, or operations, reach out to Vertex. You can find them at vertex-us.com. That's VERTEX-US.com. I think one challenge too is when people ask other people how they like their service, the thing is very few people have used more than one carrier, and certainly all the carriers, right? So their frame of reference is relative to what they know. So you might ask somebody that has, let's say, AT&T, how do you like your service? And they're like, oh, it's great. But for all they know, where they live and work, T-Mobile could be better, or Verizon could be better. So that's always, I think, a challenge for people is how do they really get a frame of reference? And so I think what's good is there's actually a lot of resources out there that maybe surprisingly a lot of people don't know are there for you to research and answer those questions for yourself. All of the carriers have their service maps, right? You can go in there and you get their little flyer and you can see this blob and it's zoomed out so far, you're not exactly sure where you live in that blob or where you work in that blob. But beyond that, there's some cool stuff that's going on that maybe we'll fill our listeners in on. The first is a relatively recent change. The FCC recently started a collection of all the carriers' coverage maps in one place where you can compare all of them to each other. So the FCC has a website now. We'll put a link to that in our show notes and on our blog post on 5gguys.com, where they have maps of the coverage predictions from all of the carriers. It's basically the same maps that all the carriers hand out in their stores, but it's all in one place. And it's exclusive to 4G and 4G only. It doesn't map 2G, 3G, doesn't map 5G. It's just 4G. So I think that's something that customers could look at. There's a push to try to get the carriers to put up actual measured performance data on that FCC website, but the carriers are pushing back on that right now. They have some concerns about whether that'll be fairly measured or not, so which could be valid. So I think that's one source of information. I don't know if have you checked that out at all, Wayne?
Not on the FCC side. I haven't. Some of the other ones you have listed, I think we're going to go through. We can talk a little bit. I'm closer to root metrics for a reason. It's because a lot of our projects that we build are root metric type sites. Mm-hmm. And so once the carriers knew how they were going to be measured, their network built to those metrics. You know what I mean? So
those figures, right? So yeah, talk about root metrics. Tee that up for our listeners and tell them more about it, and I can fill in any blanks.
Yeah, I mean, so root metrics has been around for quite a while. It gives you the same data, I think, that the FCC does, and maybe they could be providing data to the FCC. I don't know. Root metrics site is a site that's a high peak area that they're measuring performance on, both speed, reliability, network uptime, drop calls, all the things that they get measured on. And so root metrics, and I'll let you jump in here too. They put a report on. They do measure 5G now. Mm-hmm. And right now you can start to see the progress of the 5G build, which I think is probably more valuable than actually maybe the information, since it's just 2020 and just everything's starting to pick up. in 5G, but RootMetrics is one that we've built sites, we've managed sites, we brought fiber to sites in the RootMetrics sites, and they're specific, to each carrier to get their scores up in each market. Yeah. But it's market driven by city, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's good. Rootmetrics.com. We'll also put a link to that in our show notes and on our blog on the website. But yeah, they are focused. First of all, they're focused very domestically in the United States. That's their focus. Yeah. And they perform basically what's called a drive test, where they've got equipment highly calibrated in a vehicle, and they're driving a route the same every time. And every 6 months they redrive that. So they evaluate a market every 6 months, all the major markets. And they just do that on a rolling basis for all these major markets. I think there's over 100 that they have on their website. And to your point, that route becomes obvious. And so, all of the carriers can cheat, and they can, try to build out so that they score better on that route. But I think it's still a good foundational real world data versus prediction maps like what the FCC has. Those are just predictions, like the Weather Channel gives you predictions about, what the weather's going to look like tomorrow. It's all statistical modeling. So what RootMetrics has given us is actual measured data, which is really valuable. And then the other thing that RootMetrics straps on is they have an app as well. So there are users that have the app. It's also recording actual call performance where those users are at in addition to that drive route. And so it's pulling in some of that data as well, which is also, I think, valuable and interesting to look at. So yeah, RootMetrics has been around for a while, and they have some really good resources for people to go and drill down into where you live and work and play to check out. There's also another one called OpenSignal. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Nah, tell me about that one. I don't know.
So OpenSignal is similar to RootMetrics, but they're global. So they're doing this same sort of approach all around the world, but they're doing it 100% based on crowdsourced data. So they also, like RootMetrics, have an app. Users download the app. That app is providing them information so that they can do what they would need to look up. But that app is also recording performance data from that user's phone to upload that to their cloud servers. And then they're doing all this analytics on that crowdsourced data from people's phones. So it's 100% based on, their app users' data and the analytics of that. What's nice about OpenSignal is it gives you a global view. So if you're going to, somewhere across the world for vacation or business, you can look and see who's got the best service where you're going if you're going to go buy a SIM or what have you from that carrier. So pretty good source of data as well.
Yeah, interesting. It sounds like it's very similar to Waze, right? Mm-hmm. The traffic app, Waze, it's getting user data, it knows where things are, and that's how Waze works and so much more effective than the other apps. But of course, I think they're all catching up now, Google Maps,
right.
But it is all crowdsourced. It's an interesting thing. What you brought up earlier, like most people don't have but one service. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to break the habit of getting in a new carrier and switching out. I did for a while, for quite a few years. I think it got started in 2007 for me. Verizon did not have the iPhone, so I had an AT&T iPhone and a Verizon phone since I worked on both networks, and we were using access control at the time. So I carried two phones for almost 10 years. I had two phones, two networks, I had AT&T and Verizon. And, overall, as a power user running a business, I had really great coverage. I really couldn't complain about, overall use of my phone. And, now we get, I think as anything, we get picky, like I've been to a Red Rocks concert a few weeks ago. Went to see Jimmy Buffett, but I was wanting to send a photo, or a small video clip to a buddy of mine, and I had nothing there at the venue. I was kind of frustrated. And so I think to your point, we'll always continue to be frustrated, with the coverage that we have, mm-hmm. and then even 5 years from now, we'll still have those type of issues.
Yeah. Yeah. There's always areas in a wireless network where you're going to have issues, and they're not consistent either. It might work. That same Red Rocks location you're at when there's not a concert going on might have worked perfectly fine, but they were capacity constrained at the time. Right. So it wasn't a coverage problem. Maybe it might've been that they have so many other users at that same concert with the same service as you that it wasn't able to handle the capacity demand at the time. It very well could have been. So those are all factors that the root metrics of the world are definitely taken into account because they're gathering that statistically. Now, I'm not aware of anybody that's doing benchmarking like at a venue while an event's going on. That would be interesting if somebody did. I'm not aware of any source of that kind of data, but it would be cool if there was something. And so we'll keep an eye on that. So yeah, so go to 5gguys.com, look at the show notes. We'll have the link to all of these sources of data. That's definitely, I think, the best way you can go if you're looking to make a decision to look at where you live, work, and play. I think there's a couple other factors I want to make sure we leave with listeners as well. And you touched on a little bit. Verizon and AT&T really, for all intents and purposes, have the longest legacy of networks in the U.S., right? Their networks go clear back to, the late 80s, early 90s when their networks started being built. So what I generally tell people, if they are spending a lot of time in rural parts of the U.S., outside of population centers, 8 times out of 10, Verizon and AT&T probably are going to have a leg up. Now, there's going to be specific instances where that's not the case, right? But I think that's a good general answer that I've seen. For people that travel internationally a lot, I oftentimes point them to T-Mobile because T-Mobile has the best international roaming agreements, in my opinion, and definitely the most affordable ones. So, if you're in Europe, you're in the Caribbean, you're in South America, what have you, I found T-Mobile to be the most agnostically capable of roaming. And I'm not going to get a huge bill in the mail when I get home from vacation for my roaming costs while I'm gone. So I think that's another area of focus. Sprint and T-Mobile networks are being merged right now. So, as that process is going on, there's going to be some glitches, right? It takes some work and there's going to be some glitches while it's happening. But once that gets ironed out, I think you're going to see a big bump in T-Mobile's network as a result of adding all of those Sprint sites to that T-Mobile network. So I think that's something worth keeping an eye on for consumers as well.
Hey, here's a question for you. We haven't talked about. Who's your provider?
That's a good question. So I currently use T-Mobile. I used to use Verizon. I was always really happy with Verizon for a long time, especially when I would get out hunting, fishing, skiing. Worked really well for me. But as you know me well, I'm a huge football fan. And It just so happened that the city in which I go to football games every fall for college football would not work on Verizon because of capacity problems whenever I was. And so that alone, I was frustrated with. And so I made the switch to T-Mobile and my service at football games is better now, but it's not as good at home anymore. So
that's interesting. I think Vertex works on that project as a piece of it. And you're talking about this in Boulder, right?
Yeah.
We were, that's an older stadium and there's all kinds of, we could get into, why that was a difficult project to provide service and what they did. But I totally understand, and switching and finding a network that works best for you. And that's what we're really saying here, right? What is your best use case as a person, as a user? And I'm sure there's other things that you didn't even discuss here with like pricing, how it's priced,
customer service.
Yeah, all of those things come in that we didn't even touch in this conversation, for sure.
I think one other thing I almost forgot about to point out is, and people don't understand that, we always talk about the big three. It used to be the big four with Sprint, but the big three, T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T. But there's upwards of 90 other cellular carriers in the U.S. Smaller regional carriers, the largest of which would be U.S. Cellular. So for those in the Midwest and the Chicago area, they would be familiar with U.S. Cellular as a name. C-Spire and in the South is another large one. But there's tons of small regional carriers that are providing service in a lot of communities that are less populated, tier 2, tier 3 population centers that, if you live in some of those areas, it's highly advisable to look at them as your carrier because they have roaming agreements with the big three and vice versa. So when you look at the big three coverage maps, a large portion of that blob of service is not owned by those three carriers. It's owned and operated by one of these 90 regional carriers who are basically selling access to that network to the big three. And then it goes vice versa as well. So if you are a customer of US Cellular and you leave the US Cellular footprint, you're going to be on one of the big three's network for your service. So I think that's something worth looking at as well, because you may very well get better customer service and better pricing for the same service as going to the big three that's just using that regional carriers network anyways.
But you brought up another point. It's funny how these podcasts, as we talk, it's so they expand, right? And so let's throw this term in here, and the MVNO, right? Because now Xfinity has service. I was trying to think, Ryan Reynolds, he's got some great commercials. His is called Mint.
Right,
I think.
right.
Yeah, and we should probably have an episode where we discuss what those are and how those MVNOs work, because and Walmart actually runs one, I think, don't they?
Yeah, you've got Boost Mobile, and you've got a lot of those other, some MVNO stands for Mobile Virtual Network Operator. So the word virtual is what's key. These are basically sales and marketing companies. Consumer Cellular is another one. What they're doing is they're buying minutes and bits off of another carrier's network and reselling it under a different brand name. So they're wholesale buying at a discount and then reselling that. So, I don't know what Mint's using. I know Consumer Cellular, I believe. I know for sure that Xfinity Comcast is using Verizon's network. So when you get service from Xfinity Comcast, you're getting Verizon service, but you're buying it from Xfinity Comcast under a large wholesale purchase agreement that they did with Verizon. So it's worth looking at some of those MVNOs because you can get a really good deal. But I also alert people that oftentimes you're getting lower priority access to that carrier's network. So if I'm a Verizon customer and you're an Xfinity Comcast customer, we're right next to each other using that network, I may be getting a higher priority access to those network resources than you as an Xfinity Comcast customer. So it's something to be aware of, but I think it's a great value proposition to look at.
Yeah, because then you get bundled with Xfinity's other products at home, internet. Yeah, that's an interesting topic. As the industry changes, I do think this is important for us to say when we talk about the carriers and all. Network reliability has definitely came up. I mean, we are at a great point of where it's really reliable no matter where you go. And for most of us in our lives, we can get coverage. Now, I'm sure there's always that hole, like right down the street from my house, and I drop a call like at least one out of every 5 calls down there. But over time, all those things get filled, and we have great coverage no matter where we're going or what we're doing, whether it's recreational or business or just travel. It's improved dramatically.
Yeah, I agree. I think our frame of reference of what we consider good today is so much better than what we considered good 15, 20 years ago. Yeah. So, well, hopefully that kind of gives listeners a good sense of kind of our take on it. For sure, I guarantee you there's lots of people out there that disagree with everything we said today, or at least some of what we said, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and like I said earlier, I have to say I'm biased.
Yeah.
Right. I built a network for my whole career, and I love the reliability of that network. So go Red.
Awesome. Well, thanks. I hope this helped everybody. Thanks for joining us again. As always, like or follow the show. Tell your friends. Go to 5gguys.com to follow up. Check out the show notes for today's show for the links to all these resources. And until next time, have a good one.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the 5G Guys. For more resources and to connect with Dan and Wayne, check out their website at 5gguys.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that follow button and share this episode with your friends and family.